No, please wake up! Officer, can you hear me? Oh God, please! Please, I don't know what happened to him. I just saw him laying down.
Ma'am, calm down.
Please.
This is a story that began in the early hours of a winter morning. A quiet suburb, a snowstorm moving through Canton, Massachusetts, a police officer lying unresponsive outside a home, and a woman who says she did not hit him. John O'Keefe was a Boston police officer. Friends describe him as steady, loyal, devoted to his family. He had endured loss earlier in life and stepped in to raise his niece and nephew after tragedy struck his family. To many, he was the dependable one. Karen Reed was his girlfriend, a former finance professor, educated, assertive, confident. Their relationship, according to friends, had highs and lows. Some described tension, others described affection. On the night of January 28, 2022, they went out drinking with friends. It was cold. Snow began to fall. The group moved from one location to another. Eventually, O'Keefe was expected to go to a house at 34 Fairview Road, where other off-duty law enforcement officers were gathering. Shortly after midnight, Karen Reed drove him there in her SUV. Hours later, John O'Keefe was found outside that same house in the snow, severely injured. He did not survive. Prosecutors say Karen Reed backed into him with her vehicle during an argument and left him in the snow. They argue she drove away, leaving him exposed in freezing temperatures. The defense presents a different account. They argue he entered the house. They suggest something happened inside. They claim he was injured during an altercation and later placed outside. They argue investigators focused too quickly on Karen Reed and ignored other leads. From the beginning, two stories emerged. In one version, this is a tragic case of anger, alcohol, and reckless action. In the other, this is a case of loyalty, silence, and a possible cover-up. The timeline that morning is critical. At approximately 12:30 a.m., Karen Reed's SUV was seen near the Fairview address. Snow continued to fall. Surveillance footage later became a point of intense scrutiny. Taillights, tire tracks, movement in driveways, missing minutes of video. Around 6 a.m., Karen Reed and others returned to the house, concerned that John O'Keefe had not come home. According to testimony, she repeatedly said, "Could I have hit him?" They found him outside, covered in snow. First responders arrived. Efforts were made to revive him. He was transported to the hospital. He was pronounced dead. The medical findings showed head trauma and other injuries. The interpretation of those injuries would become central to the trial. Was he struck by a vehicle? Or did those injuries occur another way? As the snow melted in the days that followed, questions only deepened. Neighbors, friends, fellow officers, everyone knew each other. Canton is not a large city. Relationships overlap. Allegiances matter. Investigators collected pieces of broken tail light near the scene. The prosecution argues those fragments match Karen Reed's damaged rear light. The defense challenges when and how those pieces were found. The case quickly moved beyond a local tragedy. It became a national headline. Supporters of Karen Reed gathered outside courtrooms, holding signs that read "Free Karen Reed." They questioned the integrity of the investigation. They dissected body camera footage. They analyzed surveillance clips frame by frame. At the same time, others focused on the loss of a police officer. They pointed to physical evidence. They pointed to statements made in panic. They asked why Karen Reed reportedly said she might have hit him. The storm outside that night eventually passed. But inside courtrooms, another storm was building. When investigators began building their case, they turned to technology. Doorbell cameras, home surveillance systems, police body cameras, cell phone records. In modern trials, juries no longer rely only on testimony. They watch, they rewind, they pause, they look for what others might have missed. The early morning hours of January 29th became the center of intense scrutiny. At approximately 5:46 a.m., Karen Reed returns to 34 Fairview Road with two women, concerned about John O'Keefe. The snow has thickened. The street appears quiet. The driveway is coated in white. Video from the area captures the SUV pulling in. Observers quickly focus on the rear passenger side taillight. Prosecutors argue that this light had been shattered hours earlier when Reed reversed into O'Keefe. They later present photographs of a heavily damaged red lens. They show recovered fragments found in the snow near where O'Keefe was discovered. The defense responds with a different claim. They argue that the taillight seen in early footage appears largely intact. They point to angles where the lens does not appear destroyed. They suggest snow covering the surface creates confusion. They question whether the fragments are collected immediately or appeared later. The debate becomes technical. How much damage is visible at 5:46 a.m.? What does snow conceal? Does camera resolution distort detail? Frame by frame, supporters on both sides study the footage. Another issue emerges. Missing video. Clips presented in court show segments of movement, yet some time windows are absent. There's no clear footage of Karen Red arriving back at her own home around 12:36 a.m. There's no clear, continuous recording of her leaving again with others. The prosecution argues that gaps are routine. Cameras overwrite. Systems malfunction. Storage settings vary. The defense argues something else. They say key moments are not accounted for. They suggest selective preservation. They question why certain angles freeze or skip. In one segment, the image appears to stall. In another, the camera jumps forward. Jurors watch these sequences more than once. The tone in court grows sharper. Defense attorneys ask investigators when exactly they collected tail light fragments. They press about chain of custody. They ask whether snow was disturbed before photographs were taken. The prosecution counters by emphasizing physical evidence. Red plastic fragments were recovered. They match the make and model of Reed's SUV. They were found near O'Keefe's body. But the defense introduces another argument. What if those fragments were not deposited during impact? What if the vehicle damage occurred at another time? They highlight testimony suggesting that Karen Reed's SUV was later moved and examined under different conditions. The argument shifts from emotion to precision. Timing, measurements, distances, one detail captures attention. Investigators estimate that the SUV would have had to reverse approximately 60 to 90 feet to create the impact described by prosecutors. In court, the quiet suburban street is described in detail. Snow-dampened sound. Houses sit close together. Engines echo in still air. The defense asks a pointed question. Would no one inside the house hear a large SUV reversing aggressively in the early hours of the morning? Would no one step outside? Witnesses inside the Fairview house testify that they did not see O'Keefe enter. They say they were socializing. Some say they left before midnight. Others state they did not notice anything unusual outside. Phone data becomes another layer. Text messages between people in the house that night are examined. The timing of calls is dissected. One search phrase later becomes controversial and widely discussed online. Did someone search about hypothermia before O'Keefe was found? Experts debate extraction reports from phones. Defense attorneys argue that certain digital evidence was overlooked or misinterpreted. Prosecutors argue that the timing supports their theory. The tension in the courtroom grows with each technical witness. Meanwhile, public interest surges. Supporters gather outside the courthouse holding signs. They chant. They accuse investigators of bias. They question relationships between law enforcement officers involved in the case. At the same time, others focus on O'Keefe's family. They sit through testimony about injuries, about final moments, about impact. Medical evidence becomes central. The prosecution's medical experts testify that O'Keefe's injuries are consistent with being struck by a vehicle. They describe blunt force trauma to the head. They describe the position in which he was found. The defense presents experts who challenge that conclusion. They question whether certain injuries match a vehicle strike. They suggest alternative explanations. The jury listens to two interpretations of the same body, two interpretations of the same night, two interpretations of the same snow-covered lawn. Another controversial thread emerges during testimony involving relationships within the social circle. Questions are raised about Brian Higgins, a federal agent who was present at the Fairview gathering. Brian Higgins. Text messages between Higgins and Karen Red are introduced. The tone of those messages is discussed. The possibility of romantic interest is suggested. In court, Higgins is asked directly about the nature of his relationship with Red. Was it friendly? Was it romantic? He acknowledges messages. He acknowledges a kiss. The prosecution frames this as irrelevant to the cause of death. The defense frames it as motive for conflict. If tensions existed between O'Keefe and others in that circle, could that explain what happened inside the house? The defense suggests an altercation occurred indoors. They point to the lack of blood inside the vehicle. They question the pattern of injuries. They highlight testimony about the behavior of certain individuals after the incident. The prosecution maintains that there is no credible evidence of a fight inside the house. They stress that O'Keefe was found outside near the driveway. They argue the simplest explanation remains the correct one. Karen Reed's own statements that morning are replayed in court. Body camera footage captures her distress. She repeats questions. She appears frantic. At one point, according to testimony, she says words to the effect of, "Did I hit him?" The prosecution presents this as consciousness of guilt. The defense presents it as panic, a person trying to understand an unthinkable situation. The trial becomes a study in interpretation. A phrase spoken in shock, a broken piece of plastic in snow, a vehicle reversing in darkness, a gathering of friends inside a home. Every detail is magnified. As weeks pass, testimony stretches across dozens of witnesses. Police officers, forensic analysts, medical examiners, neighbors, friends. The courtroom becomes a battleground of credibility. Defense attorneys challenge investigative procedures. They question why certain areas were not thoroughly searched at first light. They ask why additional fragments appear days later. Prosecutors insist that evidence was collected according to protocol. They argue that snow and weather conditions complicated the scene. Outside the courthouse, the public debate intensifies. Online forums analyze every frame of video. Supporters create timelines. Critics dissect transcripts. For some, this case represents distrust in institutions. For others, it represents a clear path of accountability. By the time closing arguments approach, jurors have heard two completely opposing narratives. One narrative says Karen Reed reversed her SUV in anger, struck John O'Keefe, and left him outside. The other says John O'Keefe entered the house, something violent occurred inside, and responsibility was shifted to the person who drove him there. When deliberations begin, uncertainty lingers. The jury studies video again. They review testimony. They weigh credibility. Days pass. Then comes the announcement. The jury cannot reach a unanimous verdict. A mistrial is declared. Gasps ripple through the courtroom. For John O'Keefe's family, there is no finality. For Karen Reed, there is no acquittal. For the community, there are no answers. The case does not end. A retrial is scheduled, and as the legal process prepares to begin again, the central question remains unchanged. On that snowy night in Canton, what truly happened outside 34 Fairview Road? When the judge declared a mistrial, the courtroom fell into a silence that felt heavy. Months of testimony, weeks of arguments, endless hours of video, diagrams, forensic charts, phone data, and emotional witness statements. And still no unanimous decision. For John O'Keefe's family, the loss remained raw. For Karen Reed, the charges remained active. For the town of Canton, the divide deepened. The state prepared for a retrial. In cases like this, a second trial does not begin from scratch. Both sides refine strategy. Prosecutors adjust emphasis. Defense attorneys sharpen cross-examinations. Weak points get reinforced. Witnesses get prepared again. The question is no longer only what happened. The question becomes what can be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. As retrial preparations move forward, public attention does not fade. Supporters continue to gather outside the courthouse. They hold signs, they chant, they live stream commentary. Some accuse investigators of bias. Others accuse the defense of creating confusion to distract from responsibility. This case evolves beyond a single night. It becomes a test of trust. Trust in law enforcement, trust in forensic science, trust in digital evidence, Trust in institutions. Prosecutors signal they will again focus on physical evidence. They plan to reintroduce tail light fragments found near the body. They emphasize vehicle damage. They reinforce expert testimony that blunt force trauma aligns with a vehicle strike. They focus on statements Karen Reed made in the early morning hours. They remind jurors she reportedly questioned whether she hit him. They argue those words matter. The defense signals a different focus. They plan to question investigative procedures even more aggressively. They revisit the timing of evidence collection. They revisit phone data. They revisit relationships inside the Fairview house. They suggest tunnel vision shaped the case from the beginning. If investigators decided early that Karen Reed was responsible, what evidence did they fail to pursue? In the months leading up to retrial, hearings address motions. Evidence admissibility gets debated. Attorneys argue over expert testimony. Judges weigh what jurors will be allowed to see and hear. Outside legal filings, the community remains split. Some residents avoid discussing the case in public. Others debate it openly in diners, online forums, and local meetings. Friendships strain. Allegiances form. For many, the most troubling aspect remains uncertainty. Snow covered the scene that morning. Snow melts, ice shifts, evidence buried under weather raises questions. Experts continue to debate injury patterns. The prosecution maintains that O'Keefe's injuries match being struck and left exposed to freezing temperatures. The defense counters that certain wounds do not fit that scenario. Both sides rely on specialists. In modern trials, science often becomes the anchor, but science depends on interpretation. Jurors must decide which interpretation they believe. Another layer remains emotional. John O'Keefe was not a stranger. He was a police officer. He raised children who had already endured loss. His family sits through proceedings again, forced to relive testimony about the final hours of his life. Karen Reed also sits through proceedings again. Her future depends on jurors who were not present the first time. She faces charges that carry severe consequences. The retrial places pressure on both sides. The prosecution cannot afford another divided jury. The defense cannot assume momentum from public support will sway the courtroom. Inside court, narratives return. Prosecutors reconstruct the night step by step. They walk jurors through the timeline. The bar visits, the drive to Fairview, the alleged argument, the reversing SUV, the impact, the departure. They show photos of the damaged taillight. They place fragments into evidence trays. They replay body camera footage of the chaotic morning discovery. They ask jurors to focus on consistency. Outside in the snow, broken plastic nearby, a vehicle with corresponding damage. The defense responds with its own reconstruction. They slow down the video again. They highlight what they describe as minimal visible damage in early footage. They question why certain searches inside the home were limited. They challenge digital extraction timing from phones. They raise the issue of relationships within the group that gathered that night. They ask jurors to consider whether loyalty influenced testimony. They ask jurors to consider whether fear influenced silence. Each side frames the other as incomplete. The prosecution argues the defense creates suspicion without proof. The defense argues the prosecution builds certainty on unstable ground. As retrial testimony unfolds, jurors face the same core dilemma as before. Two sharply different explanations. One must be true, but the burden rests on the state. Beyond a reasonable doubt, in high-profile cases, doubt becomes the battlefield. The defense does not need to prove an alternative suspect. They need to show that the prosecution's narrative leaves unanswered questions. The prosecution does not need to eliminate every theoretical possibility. They need to present a cohesive explanation supported by evidence. In closing arguments, tone shifts from technical to direct. Prosecutors speak about responsibility. They remind jurors of the duty to hold individuals accountable when evidence supports guilt. Defense attorneys speak about fairness. They remind jurors that suspicion is not proof. They emphasize that gaps and inconsistencies create reasonable doubt. Deliberations begin again. Jury rooms are quiet spaces. No cameras, no public commentary. 12 individuals with notes, memories, and interpretations. They review exhibits. They replay segments. They read instructions from the judge carefully. Outside, supporters and critics wait. The case has moved beyond Canton. National media covers updates. Legal analysts debate strategy. Online communities analyze testimony in real time. Yet inside that deliberation room, public opinion does not vote. Only jurors do. The broader impact of the case reaches further. Trust between residents and local law enforcement faces strain. Conversations about investigative transparency grow louder. The handling of digital evidence becomes a talking point in legal circles. Regardless of the final verdict, the case changes people. It changes how some view institutions. It changes how some view relationships. It changes how some view the thin line between accident and crime. At its core, the case returns to a single freezing night. A man lying in snow, a vehicle in a driveway, a group of people who say they did not see what happened, a woman who says she did not strike him. In tragedies like this, certainty is rare. Evidence speaks, but people interpret. Words spoken in panic echo differently depending on who listens. As retrial proceedings move forward, the central question remains steady and unresolved in the public mind. What happened between the moment John O'Keefe stepped out of that SUV and the moment he was found in the snow? The answer will determine legal consequences. But for many watching, the answer also represents something larger. It represents faith in process. Faith in truth. Faith that when snow falls and stories conflict, facts can still emerge. Until a final verdict is reached, that question hangs over Canton like the winter sky that morning. Cold, silent, waiting.